Welcome to WIDA webinars. This is a free virtual learning opportunity that offers educators insights and resources on a variety of topics relevant to educators of multilingual learners. In this webinar, you'll hear from WIDA's expert staff and researchers. If you want to be notified about upcoming WIDA webinars, sign up for our newsletters at wida.wisc.edu/news.
Okay, just wanted to give a little overview of today's presentation. After some introductions here with all of the speakers, we're going to talk a little bit about some overview of legal requirements for assessing multilingual learners. We're going to talk a little bit about the individual assessments, access for ELLs, and WIDA alternate access. And then we're going to dive in a little bit more into learning about the characteristics of MLs with disabilities and MLs with the most significant cognitive disabilities. We'll talk about WIDA's approach to accessibility, and then the meat and heart of the discussion here is really about the decision-making process and how to help navigate that with resources that WIDA has developed, as well as those that your state may have. My name is Kristen Burton. I am an accessibility and inclusion specialist on the assessment team here at WIDA, and I will pass it off to my colleague, Swathi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming good morning. I'm here on the East Coast, so shout out to any East Coast folks. My name is Swathi Chauhan, and I am also an accessibility and inclusion assessment specialist here at WIDA, and I will throw this over to Kim.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Lesage. I am an accessibility and inclusion specialist working with Kristen and Swathi. We have a small but growing team doing a lot of mighty work, and we're excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about our two focus assessments that we'll talk about today to support decision making.
Thank you. And so today we really want to help you understand the unique test designs for and accessibility features for each of our assessments, the access for ELLs and the WIDA alternate access, in order to help make decisions about student participation. If you haven't already, we just want to understand where you all are coming from and which hat you're wearing today or most days in terms of your current role. So if you could help fill out that poll, that would be great. And we will get going. I'll pass it off to Swathi.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, so welcome to the first section of our webinar, which is overview of key legal requirements for assessing multilingual learners and multilingual learners with disabilities. So this topic, it sets the foundation for our discussion today. It's essential to understand the legal framework that guides the decision-making process in assessing MLs, including those with disabilities. This section will provide a high-level overview of the key federal laws and regulations that govern how to identify, assess, and support MLs and MLs with disabilities. Understanding these legal requirements, I understand it's a little bit dry, but it helps educators and IEP teams make informed decisions about the most appropriate assessment type for each individual student. So this slide that you see on screen, it outlines some of the key federal policies related to decision-making for MLs with disabilities. It's important to note that these bullet points represent guidelines from multiple federal policies. So this includes Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, and also some Dear Colleague letters that USDE has put out to kind of clarify various points. So just a quick breakdown of these various points. The first, MLs with disabilities have options. They can participate in regular English language proficiency or ELP assessments with or without accommodations, or they may take the alternate ELP assessment. This flexibility ensures that each student's unique needs are met. Next, when providing accommodations for ELP assessments, it's really essential to ensure they don't invalidate what's being measured. The goal is to level the playing field, but not to alter the fundamental nature of the assessment and what is being measured. Accommodations can be tailored to individual student needs. They can be applied across all of the 4 domains that we had assess on access, right? Speaking, listening, reading, and writing, or just for a single domain if that's what's most appropriate for the student. Fourth, states have a responsibility to develop clear policies for participation in alternate ELP assessments. This ensures consistency and fairness across schools and districts. Next, for English learners with multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities who cannot participate in the general ELP assessment, even with accommodations, an alternate ELP assessment must be administered, right? That is our alternate access for our suite. When making these decisions about which assessment, it is crucial that IEP teams include someone knowledgeable about second language acquisition. This expertise helps ensure that language learning needs are not mistaken for learning disabilities or vice versa. Lastly, the importance of parental involvement cannot be overstated. Local educational agencies, or LEAs, need to ensure that parents who may not be fluent in English themselves are meaningfully included in the decision-making process. This might involve providing interpreters or providing translated materials to the parents. These policies, which are drawn, like I said, from various federal mandates, are designed to protect the rights of MLs with disabilities and ensure they receive appropriate assessments and support. They highlight the complex interplay between language learning and special education needs, which emphasizes, right, the importance of individualized decision-making and inclusive practices. Next, we have a poll. So just a couple of true-false questions. True or false, ESSA requires assessments to be designed using the principles of universal design. True or false, all students must participate in assessments with or without accommodations. And true or false, the use of assistive technology is not permitted on WIDA assessments. All right, I think we have over half of folks that have answered. So just to go over it, and I'm not sure if it pops up on your end, the first one is true. It does pop up. Oh, look at that. The second question, the answer is true. And the third, the right answer is false. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kim, who will take over the next section. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about our access for ELL's assessment, our alternate access for ELL's assessment, and our approach to accessibility. So defining that, so looking at some of the principles and the frameworks that we use, that we incorporate it throughout our development cycle. And so if we could go to the next slide, we can jump into that. So what is the access for ELLs? We don't have the poll up anymore. It was the first poll, but I did look at who is joining us today. And so I saw that we have folks who I'm assuming, I think I can safely assume, are pretty familiar with the access for ELLs, but we'll still talk about it a little bit. It's our large scale English language proficiency assessment that's administered to students who've been identified as our English language learners. And we administer that test from kindergarten throughout 12th grade. Access is given annually by the states in the consortium, and it's part of the mandate, the federal mandate that requires that states give an English language proficiency assessment to monitor students' progress. And the assessment focuses on English language proficiency in academic contexts. So that's our access for ELLs. And then if you want to become familiar with what it looks like for those folks who have limited experience with it, you can get a really good sense of what the access is about by going to our webpage that includes sample items and test practices specific to or tailored to the different grade clusters. So you can get a really good idea of the format, the content, the complexity of the content. And while test administrators are typically pretty familiar with the sample item page, the test practices and that sort of thing, and they use that as part of the preparation with their students, hopefully, we have also seen and recommend that educators are accessing it so they can also become familiar with what their students are going to be expected to do. And there's even, you know, some benefit in sharing this with families so that they can incorporate it in whatever supports they have for their students. So if you use this barcode, that could take you to the page, or you can, what I typically do, because I just find it very easy and convenient, is I just Google it and it comes up very easily. Google is great for finding this quickly, but we have a barcode here that you can use to route you to that page. And then if you move to the next slide, we have a little overview, a glimpse of the WIDA alternate access. And based on the poll, I think that this assessment may not be as familiar to everyone. But in brief, it is our large scale English language proficiency test that's based on alternate proficiency level descriptors that are used for English language learners with our most significant cognitive disabilities. So those students that are typically found participating in the state's alternate content assessment. So this would be the assessment that our instructional support staff has worked together. That's including our teachers, our families, folks who are working with the IEP teams, counselors that have identified the student as someone who is not only an English language learner, but would qualify for as most significant cognitive disabilities. And then, as with the Access for ELLs, we are measuring English language proficiency in an academic context for listening, reading, speaking, and writing. So it is doing very similar things, but it's most appropriate for our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And I'm just going to leave a second because Kristen is very, very tightly wound with alternate access, and I'm sure I've missed something, so I don't want to gloss over something important, but I'll leave a second in case you wanted to add a note.
Oh, you did a great job, Kim.
Okay, thanks. All right, next slide. So this is our barcode that'll take you to our webpage with sample items, test practice, other materials that you'll be able to use to become familiar with the WIDA alternate access. Again, test administrators, test coordinators, families are also welcome to use this. This is public information posted. Anybody can access this, and we would encourage educators to visit here to help support students so that they're prepared for the test when it is time to take it. So we talked about those domains, the listening, reading, writing, and speaking, and access measures English language development in these 4 areas. The listening and reading are the domains that are measuring interpretive language. So this is measuring a student's ability to comprehend English and how the students are processing, understanding, and responding to information they receive. And then we have our reading and speaking domains, and these are the domains that are doing expressive language, and we're measuring information the students produce. And so what they are, the meaning they are conveying through oral communication or written communication. To learn more about these 2 assessments, we have a space to do that. Now, you do have to have an account and access to the portal to be able to access these 2 courses. But if you have those things, then you are able to go into like more detail, find out more about it, go through the course. They're very, very helpful. You can do a course, there's one for administration, and then there's one for scoring. And you'll find that for both assessments, access for ELLs as well as alternate access. And let's see, I'm trying to make sure I don't miss any other important point in my notes. Now, I think that covers it, but I do want to reiterate, to access these courses, you have to have access to our secure portal. Go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, I'm sorry, you cut out on my end. I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, no, that's okay. Were you going to say something? I'm not sure if I cut out for other parts, but I just wanted to highlight again, if it did cut out at this part, that while you're able to access these, it will require an account and access to the secure portal, but you can find detail and support in these courses for administration and scoring for both of those assessments.
Thank you for that overview. I also just wanted to mention that at the end of the presentation, we will share a QR code where you can find a Google document where all of these links and resources are compiled. So you'll be able to take that document and be able to share that with your colleagues or to be able to use for future reference in case you're missing any of them in the chat. So now that you have heard a little bit about some of the legal requirements for testing multilingual learners and heard a little bit about the test, we wanted to dive in a little bit further to talk about multilingual learners with disabilities and multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities and their characteristics. Who are multilingual learners with disabilities? They are small but important subgroup of students in U.S. schools. And despite the subgroup small size, these students have diverse needs related to language and disability. WIDA defines multilingual learners with disabilities as individuals who have one or more disabilities as documented in their IEP or 504 plan and who are progressing towards English language proficiency in each of the 4 domains of speaking, reading, writing, and understanding the English language. So you may have seen a similar graphic like this in the past, but Short and Fitzsimmons ascertained that English learners must perform double the work of their native English speaking peers. So learning English while studying core content areas in English. With this burden in mind, we suggest that English learners who have disabilities often perform triple the work since their disability-related needs must be met as well. And if you want to learn more a little bit about this concept, we do have an Altella brief for helping to understand English learners with disabilities and a framework that we have developed. Okay, so now we want to look a little bit about the characteristics of multilingual learners that take the Access for ELL assessment. So based on our 22-23 data, approximately 2.3 million students participated in the assessment, and we can see slightly more males and females participated. Spanish continues to be the most commonly reported home language, followed by English, Portuguese, Arabic, Russian, Vietnamese, and so on. So just give you a little overview of where our students are coming from and the unique cultures and characteristics that they bring in terms of language. Approximately 11%, or a little over 300,000 students taking the Access for ELL's assessment have a documented disability through either an IEP or 504. So here you can see, based on the primary disability codes that were reported, specific learning disability is the most commonly identified disability category, followed by speech and language impairments and other health impairments. And then in the earlier grades, we see developmental delay, specifically for that category, showing up very frequently. And then also autism in our top categories for primary disabilities that are reported. And then you can see that the frequency of students participating in the Access assessment kind of drops a little bit when we talk about students who have an identified intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, and emotional behavioral disabilities in terms of their participation. Then while relatively small, we also see students who are deaf and hard of hearing, students who are blind and visually impaired, and those with traumatic brain injuries also participating in the assessment, even though potentially some of their disabilities may impact their participation in specific domains. So even with accommodation, these students are able to participate in the Access assessments. Okay, And last, we just wanted to share a little data with you about some of the most commonly used accommodations on the Access for ELLs assessment. Kim will talk a lot more about our approach to accessibility and accommodations here in a few moments. So this data was captured either through designations that were reported in AMS and or captured on our paper test booklets for students that were taking the assessments. And you can see that extended speaking time, repeat item audio, manual control, extended time, and the in-person human reader accommodations kind of top the chart. But we still have a large number of students participating through keyboarding devices and that utilize other approaches and accommodations to access the Access for ELLs assessment. Okay. Next, we want to differentiate a little bit some of the characteristics that we see for multilingual learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And although the federal policy known as ESSA that Swathi talked about a little bit earlier requires annual English proficiency assessment of English language learners, it doesn't include a specific definition of who English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities are. So again, WIDA has defined them as individuals with difficulties in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language as they are progressing towards English language proficiency, and who have one or more disabilities that significantly impact their intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. And as you may recall in that graphic that I shared earlier, depicting multilingual learners doing triple the work, English learners who have significant cognitive disabilities experience triple the work and beyond as they encounter even more labor-intensive challenges in the classroom associated with their language and disability needs. For example, English learners with significant cognitive disabilities may face challenges related to learning the content, developing English language proficiency, and even those possibly using American Sign Language or another signing system or AAC devices, among other learning opportunities and challenges. So next, I just wanted to share some of the characteristics that we see often with multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities. And I wanted to share some data that we gathered under a grant called Altella. So you might be familiar with the Advancing Altella grant that has been used to help develop our new alternate access and alternate screener. But prior to that, we had a grant called Altella, where we did a lot of research trying to understand a little bit more about the population and the challenges that exist in our states. So under this grant, we conducted a study using many of the same questions that you see on the alternate access through the individual characteristics questionnaire. This was originally one of our pilots for that questionnaire. And so you can see that we had over 1,500 students participate. And that Altella grant included additional states outside of the WIDA consortium, such as Arizona and New York. So you'll also notice that we incorporated feedback from educators in those states. And the purpose of this study was really to learn, again, more about the characteristics of English learners with significant cognitive disabilities. And we asked questions related to the students' use of language in English and other languages, as well as some other disability related needs. We did not collect any personal identifiable information and asked educators to complete one ICQ for each of the students in their classrooms. Through the data that was reported, you can see that most students were reported as having an intellectual disability as their primary disability. And of the 646 students who also were reported as having a secondary disability, we saw a large percentage of those students also being qualifying for speech and language services, and or if they were reported as having a different disability in their primary category, they had intellectual disabilities as their secondary disability as well. Similarly, we collected information on students' home language. And here, I think this is more representative of the states that participated in the study. We see that Arabic was one of the most commonly used languages, but we also see English here topping one of the most commonly used languages at home, as well as French, Haitian Creole, Mandarin, Russian, Somali, and Spanish. So overall, Spanish was one of the most commonly used home languages for primary disability categories. You can look at some of that other information there. Next, the ICQ also gathered information about a student's primary classroom setting, so where they spend the majority of their day. And you can see a large portion of students or multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities are in self-contained classrooms, often separated from their same age peers from the general ed classroom. Also, you can see that they may be participating in a general education setting, but within the resource room, or even potentially in a totally separate setting in a special school. We also gathered ways in which, or data about the ways in which students communicate. And while a large number of students are predominantly speaking or use speech as a way to communicate, we also see a large number of students who use AAC devices and communication boards, as well as eye gaze, sign, and picture cards. And I will also say here that while many students use speech as their primary method, they're often utilizing multiple modes of communication at the same time. So they might be simultaneously using their device and or, sign as they are using verbal speech as a mode of communication. Last, we just want to talk about the importance of thinking about and addressing both language and communication needs. These are distinct functions, and we often tend to focus on communication needs, but we really want to be thinking about language, particularly for instruction for multilingual learners with significant cognitive disabilities. So communication, again, is that social event that requires that sending and receiving of messages with shared understanding. So that's more of again, when we think about students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, we're often finding that effective mode of communication for students. But once that's been established, we want to be thinking about the language that we're supporting. So that structured and shared form of communication between spoken and written words, use of characters and gestures, and a combination of all of those different considerations. Before we move on, I just wanted to share one more resource with you all. And this is the U.S. Department of Ed's EL Toolkit, which was published back in 2015 as a companion to support some of those Dear Colleague letters that Swathi discussed in the beginning of the presentation. And the toolkit helps states and local education agencies help English learners by fulfilling the various obligations that are required by law. And so this toolkit has 10 different chapters, and there's one specific on supporting multilingual learners with disabilities. And so they do share a large number of strategies to support all of the requirements with identification and serving multilingual learners. So I just wanted to call your attention to this toolkit as a great resource to be thinking about as you continue to serve students. I'm going to hand it over to Kim here to talk a little bit about WIDA's approach to accessibility and for each of our assessments and how multilingual learners with disabilities interact with our assessments.
Hey, thanks. On the next slide, we have a definition for accessibility that we use internally. And I'll say this probably multiple times throughout this segment. And it's an expression that somebody recently used in my group. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's exactly it. So it's like, it's baked in. So this is the definition that we use to help bake in our efforts to make the assessments and the tools and the resources we have accessible and inclusive. So when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about a system of approaches and supports that ensures equitable and valid access to content, processes, and procedures that meet the needs of all students, including but not limited to ethnicity, race, nationality, language, gender, disability, neurodiversity, age, sexual orientation, place of origin, beliefs, and education. And as I said, baked in, this is how we think about it internally, but for the purposes of this webinar too, that we're on the same page, and how, so that we are consistent in how we are approaching not only the information here, but as we are doing the actions of assessment, design, and development. So that approach and an implementation is accessible and equitable for everybody. So we've focused primarily on students and now are expanding that into making sure that we're also supporting our educators so that they are able to access the resources and the materials in a way that is best suited and appropriate for preparation and then administration of our assessments. We have an accessibility and accommodations manual, the WIDA Accessibilities and Accommodations Manual, often referred to as the AAM, and you'll hear me use that term. If you have done any work with test coordinating or test administration, then you're very familiar with this document or this resource. But not everybody is familiar based on the poll that we did earlier. And I don't have those stats stuck in my head for sure, but I do remember that screenshot or the glimpse, a little snapshot of it to know. And I know I'm aware that there are folks who are not familiar with it. This is also available publicly. One of those other things that I use Google to get there very quickly, but you can route through the assessment links on our website to be able to get to the accessibility and accommodations manual, but Google will serve as well to get you there. And I think there may even be a link that's available in the chat. If not, I'll make sure to get it into the webinar before we close. But this is the resource that we use to support TAs as they implement or apply accommodations or accessibility features for our students. And here we have the framework that illustrates our tiers and levels of support. So we want to make sure that all of our students who are engaging with our assessments are getting the support that's most appropriate for them to be able to access and engage with the instruments, while at the same time not compromising the instruments or what we're trying to measure or the intent and purpose of the access or the the alternate access. If we go to the next slide, we'll begin the process of talking through those different tiers of support. So there's universal design baked in, the effort to bake that in, and our definition here, many of you will be familiar with, so just pardon me as I read off the definition to you. So this is design that is usable by all people to the greatest extent with minimal or no accommodations or adaptations. And we have a screen grab here, like a picture of this sidewalk to illustrate universal design in action. So we actually read a book as our team read a book that was really insightful and gave information about some of the efforts that have been made that we just take for granted at this point, including these sidewalks like this and the opportunity to be able to use strollers or wheelchairs to access the sidewalk without having to go over that a drop off. That was part of universal design that was advocated for and now has become common practice. So those kinds of principles, we make an effort to emulate some things like that into our assessments so that all students are able to engage with our assessments with equity and that we are inclusive about it. We have our administrative considerations. So if you look at our framework, you see this is the green tier, second level up. These are considerations. While our universal design supports would apply and would be accessible to everyone, you might have testers that have administrative considerations. These are also available to all students. Part of our framework to make sure that our assessments are equitable and that you are supporting your students so that they are able to take this test in a way that's comparable to all other testers. So examples of our administrative considerations would be the supervised breaks, extended time, individual small group setting, medical devices. So there are ways to ensure that students are able to access things like this. There's the full list. I won't read through everything. And you will get copies of this presentation, so you'll be able to see it there. You'll also find these examples noted in our AAM. And then if we move to the next slide, these are our universal tools, offering another layer of support. And as the test administrator, you would go in or make sure that your students have access to these things when appropriate. Something else I want to highlight is that we would see these tools or these features implemented as part of instruction and then in administration. So not a student wouldn't see these for the first time when they are taking the access or the alternate access. They would have seen this and used this. These features would have been applied throughout their instruction as well as in their test administration. So examples of the universal tools would be the audio aids, color overlay. I talked about the projection onto a screen if that is needed, magnification, scratch paper, sticky notes, things like that. Accommodations is the blue tier seen in our framework. This one, while available to students, does require a process that would involve the instructional support team and instructional documentation or documentation about these features that are used for the students. So you would not just go in and permit accommodations. This would have to be documented. And these are changes that remove barriers and are not available to all students like our universal design or administrative consideration features might be, but with instructional documentation, IEPs, things like that, instructional plans that indicate that this is a need, then that would be available. This is a key point that we try to do is make a distinction between the accommodations. Oh no, you were right. Thank you. The accommodations and our modifications. So they are sometimes confused when we're talking about accommodations. Our definition for that would be changes made to instructional practices and assessments that do not alter the text. And Swathi kind of touched on that when she was talking through federal guidelines. And the purpose of in that they are supports, but they do not alter the test or what is being measured. Rather, they are the supports needed to remove barriers presented by a disability. So the purpose of these is to ensure an accommodation is to ensure that students have equal access to learning or the assessment so that they're able to demonstrate what they know and what they can do without hindrance by a disability. On the other hand, we have modifications, and this involves changes made to the content or to the difficulty of the task or to the assessment. And these modifications are used when accommodations are not addressing the student's need as accommodations might. Now, this is something different and something separate. We would advise that you, depending on your communication tree, this would be something that you would need to work with your LEA, of course, your State Department. Also refer to the AAM for clear guidance about how to address accommodations and then recommendations made about modifications because we want to make sure we are avoiding modifying the test. So I'm going to give you some examples of what modifications would be, and that's like reducing the workload, simplifying a task or simplifying an assignment, changing grading criteria or scoring, and using maybe alternate prompts, stimulus, alternate curriculum. So those would be modifications. Our next slide will give examples of accommodations. And so many of you will be familiar with these. There's a whole list here. You can also find this list in our AAM. So you don't have to memorize it. You don't need to take a screenshot. Examples of accommodations would be the extended testing time, which is permitted, but you will want to make sure that you have a plan for that. Human reader, interpreter for ASL, large print, Braille, and I'll just give you a second to read through the others. All right, next slide. And this is a consideration that is not represented in our framework, but we do acknowledge that domain exemptions exist, or the need for domain exemptions may be there and exist. But we start with the knowledge that state and federal laws require that all ELs, our multilingual learners, participate in an annual English language proficiency assessment. So, and if it's access, alternate access, I know we have folks, I saw in the poll that we have others, so maybe you are not necessarily a part of the consortium, but you are in a state that is going to have to provide a test. All students who are identified as English language learners are required to take a test. So I want to highlight that because we are having a conversation about domain exemptions. So while that might need to be a consideration, we understand that a student still has to take, there still has to be measurement of English language proficiency. So no disability exempts a student from this requirement. However, there are rare cases where exemptions might be the appropriate choice for a student with a disability. That would limit their engagement or their ability to perform and properly and appropriately demonstrate what they're able to do. So if those exemptions help create more equity, then that would be a consideration, but you would need to contact your state agency to make that determination. So whether that is you contact them directly, or if you have to go through your LEA, that is something that you would need to do as a very early step in the process. And here is our domain exemptions decision tree. You can find this in our AAM, and it walks you through the steps of coming to the conclusion that this might be a consideration that you need to take, a step you need to take. But if you notice on the screen, and it's pretty small, but you might notice that at the very last part where it's in bold, please consult with your state education agency for guidance on domain exemptions. So we have a poll question. What accommodation do you assign the most? And so we're getting a glimpse at what your experience is like, and it supports us as we create resources to support those in the field, and it also informs the work that we do. So we thought we would take this opportunity to get a little bit of information from those who are on the call. Just another note about the options we've given, because we realize that these are not the only options. The ones, the features we have noted here are ones that we have found to be infrequent assignment or frequently assigned. So we just selected those to get a little nuance and some context around what's happening in the field. But we understand that these are not the only accommodations that are assigned to for students. Okay, I think we have good activity.
Kim, can you talk a little bit about the first and second accommodations there, extended speaking and the response time for speaking?
Okay, so yeah, so extended speaking, and I want to point out, like, part of recommendations, the access and alternate access are not timed assessments, but they're and we also do have NRAM support for like scheduling, because that's still a part of it. But extended speaking is a feature that is offered as a support. Speaking there, and I'm thinking about like on the, if you were taking the online assessment, then there is a set amount of time. But if a student requires additional time, that is a feature that is supported. We recognize that students might need considerations when it comes to the amount of time that is permitted to provide their speaking response. So extended speaking is a feature that is built into our assessments. And then response time also permits the same concept of allowing that additional time, despite what and forgive me for not having the technical terms in this moment to talk about what the platform looks like. But when you assign those accommodations, students are given additional time to be able to respond appropriately, and it gives them the time to be able to process the information they need to do so that they can demonstrate their expressive English language proficiency.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
All right. So I just wanted to also mention, so WIDA is a consortium of states. So we serve a multitude of 41 different states and territories. And each of those states and territories may have their own unique policies and requirements that are separate from others within the consortium. And so that's why we always talk about how some of these things are local decisions, or that your states may have additional guidance for some of our policies and guidelines that WIDA makes recommendations on. So our WIDA recommendations and policies are really grounded in what our federal statutes say in terms of requirements, as well as the functions of our assessments, but that states are able to make additional guidance or policies to support you all at a local level. All right, so thank you, Kim, for talking a little bit about our approaches to accessibility and accommodations for each of our assessments. And next, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about those determinations. So when making a determination for an ELP assessment, IEP teams must consider a multitude of factors as to which assessment is the most appropriate for students with disabilities. WIDA has developed the alternate access participation decision tree to help IEP teams make this determination as for which assessment a student may take. Again, just wanted to reiterate that assessments are valid only if the assessment is given to students for whom it was developed. So the alternate access was developed specifically with students with the most significant cognitive disabilities as defined, again, by individual states and who have met the individual state criteria. So we just want to make sure that as you're thinking about it, that you are, again, relying on that IEP team process and decision and your state-specific guidelines as to who qualifies as a student with the most significant cognitive disability. If you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about each of those decision-making factors found within that decision-making guide. So state participation guidelines, again, supersede any element of WIDA's participation guidance. It is intended to support and not dictate participation in the WIDA alternate access. So IEP teams should be able to answer yes for each of the following different participation criteria in order for the student to participate in the WIDA alternate access. So the student should be classified as an English language learner. And when we say English language learner, we're using the federal terms for English learner. When we think about supporting our students, WIDA tends to use multilingual learners as its more asset-based approach and takes into considerations that students may be learning multiple languages, not just English, and also supports their home language. So I just wanted to point that out here as we kind of flip-flop through terms. Next, we want to make sure that the IEP team has considered that the student has the most significant cognitive disability and receives special education services under IDEA. Next, we also want IEP teams to be thinking about the student services. So this is federal language that the student must require extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains in the grade and age appropriate curriculum. And last but not least, we want IEP teams to be thinking about participation in the statewide alternate academic content assessments. So typically those start in 3rd grade, but IEP teams should be making a unilateral decision about alternate assessments. So if a student's participating in those alternate content assessments, we would also anticipate that they would be participating in an alternate ELP assessment. Or if the IEP teams decide that the student's going to participate in the access for as long as possible, that is also part of that decision-making process. Okay. To help us understand a little bit more about the criteria that educators are using when making decisions about participation in an ELP assessment, we conducted a study focused on the following questions. Who determines whether an English learner takes alternate access, and what decision-making criteria are used? So we know that at a local level, educators are often struggling with this decision-making process. So we wanted to learn a little bit more about some of the conversations that are happening and maybe where some misunderstanding lies, where we can also help support that process and provide additional guidance to states as necessary. So in the study, it was an online study directed towards district level and school level participants, and we followed up with in-depth interviews based on the survey findings. So we asked participants if they would want to participate in a follow-up interview. All participants have had experience working with English learners with disabilities and have administered the alternate access, and or have been part of the decision-making process to determine whether or not a student should take the alternate access. So we had over 300 participants from 35 different WIDA states or territories participate in the study, and the majority of students served larger districts with over 2,500 students. And that had a larger number of English learners as well. And here you can see some of the top participating states. The primary role of our participants were on the English language development side. So they were specifically either ESL bilingual teachers or Title III coordinators. We did have some district administrators participating in the study, as well as special education teachers or district test coordinators. Just a little bit here about the experience. Most of our participants had over 10 years of experience, so a multitude of experiences serving multilingual learners and multilingual learners with disabilities, and have been part of those IEP processes, as well as instructional discussions. Talking a little bit about their certifications. We had a large number of teachers who are dually identified, but we did have some students that didn't have any special certification or license in special education. So I think that's one critical thing we want to continue to be thinking about as we serve our multilingual learners with disabilities, is that touch point for collaboration between departments. We did gather some information about the types of professional development that teachers have received in terms of guidance on how to make decision-making and what that process looks like for which assessment that students should take. And so you'll see a large number of folks are following guidance specific from their state. So potentially in addition to the WIDA guidance and trainings that we have offered, individual states offer additional support to their districts that people are taking advantage of. We also had a lot of things happening at a local level, either through professional development activities or school-based meetings and conversations that are happening more at that local level. And we did see some individuals say that they haven't received any support. So we also just wanted to mention that. We asked folks if they think the right people are involved in this decision-making process. And the majority of folks did say yes, where there is also, you know, a smaller number of folks saying either no or they're not really sure, depending on the circumstance of the student. And then we also asked a question about potential misidentification for students taking the alternate access. And the majority of folks said no, they didn't think that students were misidentified, that it was appropriate. But we still saw a significant, almost a third number of folks say that yes, potentially students are being misidentified to take an alternate access, and those students should have been participating in the access assessment. This slide again reflects a little bit about that same concept about potential misidentification, training that goes into the decision-making process. So we asked folks about how confident they feel in their decision-making regarding assigning students to take an assessment, and 64% felt very confident, while we still had a larger number of folks saying either they were somewhat confident or not confident at all. And then we asked a question about the challenges in decision making and how often folks feel that they struggle with that decision making. 67% said that they rarely do, while 27% said some of the time, 4% said most of the time, and I know it's really hard to read there, but a smaller percent said all of the time that they feel challenged in that decision-making process. So we also broke up by grade clusters, which were the most challenging grade levels for decision-making. And unsurprisingly, educators really struggle in those early grades, the K2 grade clusters, with over 165 folks saying that that's where they find it to be the most challenging. And so we do always recommend that in those early grades, IEP teams are considering opportunities to learn and not making decisions about alternate assessments too quickly as they continue to learn about the students. They continue to think about effective modes of communication for that student, particularly for newcomers as they're coming in and they may be in that transition phase. That is also true, I think, for states with their content assessments. There's always a caution about making decisions too early, too soon, and trying to allow students an opportunity to engage and participate in general ed classrooms content assessment for as long as possible, with additional supports and strategies being offered to those students. All right, so based on all of those questions, we just have a quick poll question for you to talk about a little bit and reflect on your own experiences. So, are families part of the decision-making process in your school? I'm just watching the poll and I'm very excited to see all of the yeses that are popping up on the screen, that you all are meaningfully including parents in that decision-making process. So that is amazing. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Swathi for some final thoughts as you guys continue to think about the decision-making process being implemented in your schools and districts, and as you reflect upon the information that was shared by Kim and I.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your questions and your patience, and I'm going to bring it on home. So in terms of final thoughts here, as we conclude this presentation, this slide represents a really powerful assumption, right? The least dangerous assumption is to presume competence. This principle is at the heart of equitable and effective education for all of our students, particularly those who are multilingual learners and those with disabilities, those students who really require those additional supports. The acting on the presumption of competence provides students with the opportunity to learn, achieve, and ultimately become more independent. So this idea, this concept really challenges us to approach each of our students with the belief in their potential. And when we presume competence, we set high expectations for all of our learners. We provide rich, grade level appropriate content and instruction. We can offer necessary supports and accommodations so that students are able to access their content. And we create opportunities for students to demonstrate their knowledge and their skills. And in doing so, right, we avoid the risk of underestimating our students' abilities, and we create a more inclusive, empowering, and effective educational environment for all of our learners and our students. So building on that principle of presuming competence, we have this can-do philosophy, and a lot of you, if you're in access or alternate access world, you are familiar with our can-do. So this approach focuses on students' capabilities and potential rather than the limitations, right? So like asset-based language. First and foremost, multilingual learners with disabilities can learn complex language and communication systems, which affirms their cognitive abilities and potential for growth, challenging any preconceptions about their capacity to acquire language. Secondly, these students can improve their measures of academic language growth. This point emphasizes the importance of setting high expectations and providing appropriate support to facilitate their progress. It's crucial to recognize that multilingual learners with disabilities do have specific learning needs that differ from those of other students with disabilities. We talked a little bit about that in earlier sections. They're doing triple the work. This acknowledgement ensures that we provide tailored support that addresses both their language learning and disability-related needs. An important insight is that students who do not respond verbally, they do understand. This reminds us to not equate verbal communication with comprehension and to seek alternative ways for students to demonstrate their understanding. Lastly, multilingual learners with disabilities do benefit from English development services. This underscores the importance of providing comprehensive language support even when a student has a disability. This can-do philosophy aligns perfectly with our presumption of confidence. It challenges us to focus on possibilities rather than limitations, to provide rich learning opportunities, and to believe in the potential of every student to learn, grow, and achieve. Next. Okay, so we would love your feedback as it helps inform our work. As I'm wrapping up here at the end, I invite you to use the QR code on the screen or a link in the chat to complete a quick survey. And I'm going to give you about 2 to 3 minutes to complete that before we fully wrap up. And we thank you for participating in the survey.
Swati, I think as folks are looking at that survey, I think we also have a little time to maybe review some of the questions that have come in through the chat and provide a little bit more. Oh, sorry about that. I know that you have been trying to respond to some questions throughout the presentation, but I think there's a few more that we could probably address here in our remaining time.
Yes, there are. If you want to, do you want me to go through them, Kristen?
I can pick a few, and then
Okay.
Kim or Swati, if you guys want to jump in on a response, I think that would be great.
Go for it.
So there was a question from Jennifer. What type of training is required for a special education teacher to administer either the access or the alternate access?
And this one, I did put a response in the chat. This one, if you visit your member or state page at the top of the WIDA website, there are testing dates and policies around, which assessment is being used in your state. There's a specific secure portal that is required in order to get some training on all of the various kinds of access, right? We've got paper access, online access, kindergarten access, and then alternate access. So you need to have that portal information in order to get that training.
Thank you, Swati. And I see some of you all are helping each other out and answering each other's questions in the chat. So that's amazing as well.
Yeah, and in that, noticing that, just a reminder that we're not all from the same state, so there will be some nuance. So I noticed, specific guidelines for different states. So that, and I think that is an important distinction that the group has acknowledged in the chat, is that the requirements for you might be different than in other states. And they follow some basic guidelines that won't violate federal guidelines, but you will see some differences among the states. And another note, yes, thank you for catching the typo. It's extended time, which is EM, and the extended speaking for that response time. So thank you for catching that. And I saw a lot of feedback making sure that people were clear and corrected about, or had the correct understanding about that. And I think there was another question early on, and so I'm just going to bring it up about scoring, and that yes, you're required to complete those the courses and receive the certification to be able to both administer and score the different domains. But as like we've said throughout, you'll want to make sure you also refer to your state guidelines to get the details about what's entailed and who will provide that. Because I'll just, kind of give an illustration. In some cases, the LEA will manage the trainings. And so that might look a little bit different about how you access the trainings. But whatever the case, yeah, you'll have to complete that and then be certified to be able to do the administration and the scoring.
And I think, Kim, there was a question too, more specific to our WIDA screener assessments. And so there are also certification courses for those for the administration process of the screeners. So again, in the secure portal under assessments, you'll be able to find a multitude of those trainings. There was a question about alternate access and if it's available to all states within the WIDA consortium. Swati, do you want to respond to that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I was getting pinged.
Is alternate access available to all states in the WIDA consortium?
Yes, it is, but just check with your specific state if they are utilizing the alternate access.
Neat.
While you're answering questions or looking at the questions, Kristen, on the screen, we have another QR code. I know we threw a lot of links at you in the chat, and this was asked early on, but we did put a little helpful Google Doc together that has all of those links through that QR code. And I also put a little tiny URL if you don't have the QR code that you can use, and it will give you access to all of those links that we talked about, and plus a bonus link from the Office of Special Education that has a specific webpage about what works when testing English language learners.
Thanks, Swati. There was a question about if a student is exempt from a specific domain, how does WIDA come up with a score? And so I'll just say that again, because that domain exemption process and procedures, as we were talking about, is very state specific. I would encourage you to contact your states about that. ISRs right now are developed or produced for the domains that were participated in, but WIDA has provided some additional guidance for states to consider if they think about scores for students that have less than 4 domains. But right now that is an individual state decision about how those scores are produced and or released for specific accountability purposes, as well as consideration for individual student instruction. Kim or Swati, are there any other questions that you see that we may have missed that you want to address?
I didn't see other ones, and I just want to thank Swati for staying on top of those questions. You did a really great job. Also, Molly, I saw a lot of answers there, but I don't think we did, and I apologize if we overlooked anybody, but the chat was pretty active. So I did my best scan and I think we're good.
I did want to address one more. I just saw as I was scrolling through, and there was a question about what suggestions do you have for students who are not yet identified as needing an IEP or 504 plan. And I just wanted to go back to one of Swathi's closing slides about the least dangerous assumption is to presume competence. And so we know that students, newcomers, come with a variety of experiences and needs. And so while we're going through some of those initial identification processes and or evaluation processes for special education, we always want to assume that level of competence and provide them that opportunity to learn and to demonstrate what they possibly need to know. And so we would always encourage at WIDA participation in the access assessment while some of those determinations and evaluations are being made. Again, but I would recommend strongly that you contact your SEA with any specific questions about an individual student. We know that these are not sometimes easy conversations, cut and dry decisions to make, as there's many different nuances and complex situations that play into that. I think that your states may have a little bit more specific guidance if students aren't meeting the specific criteria and or some of the thoughts that WIDA has provided.